The sun-drenched church stood like a beacon against the vast Montana sky as Benjamin Wade adjusted his string tie. Heart thundering harder than the hooves of any wild Mustang he'd ever broken. 7 years had passed since he'd abandoned this same altar, leaving behind the only woman he'd ever loved and a town full of whispers that followed him like shadows. Benjamin's weathered hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down his black suit jacket, the finest he owned, purchased specially for this day. His dark hair was freshly cut, his face clean-shaven for the first time in months. The church's wooden pews were filled with the citizens of Redemption Springs, some whispering behind gloved hands, others casting wary glances his way. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad, not a bride," Sheriff Tom Mercer said, clapping Benjamin on the shoulder. Benjamin managed a tight smile. "Feels about the same, Tom. She might not come," Tom said, voicing the fear that had haunted Benjamin since he'd returned to town 3 months ago. "I know," Benjamin replied, his voice barely audible over the soft notes of the organ, "but I'll wait this time. I'll wait forever if I have to." The year was 1877, and Benjamin Wade had spent the last 7 years trying to outrun his past. After abandoning Jessamine Miller at this very altar, he had wandered from Colorado to Kansas, working cattle drives and taking odd jobs, all while carrying the weight of his greatest mistake. Now, at 32 years old, he had returned to make things right if she would have him. The church doors creaked open, and Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. But it was only Mrs. Patterson, arriving late and scurrying to her seat with an apologetic nod. Benjamin exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the double doors at the rear of the church. The organist played on, the same melody repeating as minutes stretched like hours. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Benjamin stood firm, his boots rooted to the floorboards. The pocket watch in his vest ticked relentlessly, marking time in a way that seemed both too fast and too slow. Benjamin's mind drifted back to the day he'd first laid eyes on Jessamine Miller. It was the spring of 1868, and he'd ridden into Redemption Springs with little more than his horse, his gun, and the clothes on his back. Jessamine had been standing outside her father's general store, her chestnut hair gleaming in the sunlight as she arranged a display of fabrics. At 20 years old, she was the most beautiful woman Benjamin had ever seen, with eyes the color of wildflower honey and a smile that could tame the wildest heart. "Excuse me, miss," he'd said, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for work. Heard the Miller Ranch might be hiring." She'd looked up, measuring him with a glance that seemed to see right through him. "That would be my father's place. I'm Jessamine Miller." "Benjamin Wade," he'd replied, extending a hand that she took with surprising firmness. "You know anything about horses, Mr. Wade?" "Been around them my whole life, madam." Her smile had warmed then. "Well, that's fortunate. We lost our horse trainer last month to a widow in Billings. Pa's been looking for someone with the right touch." That had been the beginning, a simple exchange that had changed the course of Benjamin's life. By the end of that summer, he'd become indispensable to Jackson Miller's horse breeding operation, and more importantly, he'd fallen hopelessly in love with Jessamine. Their courtship had been proper but passionate, filled with stolen moments and promises whispered under Montana stars. Within a year, Benjamin had saved enough to buy a small plot of land adjacent to the Miller property, and he'd proposed on a snowy Christmas Eve, giving Jessamine his mother's ring. The wedding had been planned for June 15, 1870, a date that still burned in Benjamin's memory. Everything had been perfect until the night before, when a stranger rode into town bringing news that would shatter Benjamin's world and set him on a path of destruction. The memory of that fateful night still made Benjamin's chest tighten, the stranger a grizzled U.S. Marshal named Frank Daniels had recognized Benjamin from a wanted poster. Not for any crime Benjamin had committed, but for his connection to his outlaw brother, Billy Wade. "Your brother's been caught robbing banks across 3 territories." Marshal Daniels had informed him in the shadowy corner of the town saloon. "He's wounded and asking for you, says you're the only family he's got left." Benjamin had protested, explaining about the wedding, but the marshal's next words had sealed his fate. "He's likely to hang, son. If you want to say goodbye, you'd best come now." That night, torn between loyalty to his brother and his love for Jessamine, Benjamin had made the decision that would haunt him for 7 years. He'd written a hasty note to Jessamine, inadequate, cowardly words that explained nothing, and ridden out with the marshal before dawn. He'd found Billy in a jail cell in Wyoming Territory, shot in the chest and barely clinging to life. For 3 weeks, Benjamin had stayed at his brother's side, watching him recover only to be sentenced to hang for his crimes. The night before Billy's execution, his brother had helped him escape, forcing Benjamin to become an accomplice and a fugitive himself. For 2 years, Benjamin had ridden with Billy's gang, not participating in their robberies but unable to extricate himself from their web. It was only after Billy was killed in a shootout with Pinkerton agents that Benjamin had finally broken free, spending the next 5 years working his way back to respectability under assumed names. And now, here he stood, pardoned by a territorial governor for his unwilling part in his brother's crimes, back in Redemption Springs, at the same altar he had abandoned, waiting for Jessamine to decide if his return warranted a second chance. The church doors swung open again, and this time, Benjamin's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Jessamine but her father, Jackson Miller, his face lined with years and hardship but his eyes as sharp as ever. Jackson walked slowly down the aisle, his limp more pronounced than Benjamin remembered. He stopped at the front pew but didn't sit, instead turning to face Benjamin with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Miller," Benjamin said, his voice barely steady. "Wade," the older man acknowledged with a slight nod. "Wasn't sure I'd see this day. Is she coming?" Benjamin couldn't help asking, the words escaping before he could stop them. Jackson's weathered face betrayed nothing. "My daughter makes her own decisions, always has." He paused, studying Benjamin's face. "You hurt her deeper than you know." "I know I don't deserve her forgiveness," Benjamin said, the words catching in his throat. "But I had to try, had to come back and make things right if I could." 7 years is a long time, Wade. People change. "My feelings haven't," Benjamin replied simply. Jackson seemed about to say more when the church doors opened once again. Every head turned, and Benjamin's heart lurched painfully against his ribs. Jessamine Miller stood in the doorway, backlit by the golden Montana sunlight. At 27, she was no longer the young woman he had left behind, but something more. Her beauty matured, her presence commanding. She wore a simple ivory dress, not the elaborate wedding gown of their first attempt, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. For an eternal moment, she stood perfectly still, her eyes finding Benjamin's across the length of the church. Then, with deliberate steps, she began walking down the aisle, alone. Benjamin couldn't breathe, couldn't move as she approached. The 7 years fell away, yet stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. When she reached the altar, stopping an arm's length away, he could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the proud tilt of her chin, the wariness in her gaze. "Jessamine," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "Benjamin," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "You asked me to come, I'm here," he swallowed hard. "I didn't know if you would." "Neither did I," she admitted, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. "I wasn't sure until this morning." Benjamin wanted to reach for her hands but restrained himself. "Thank you for coming, for giving me a chance to explain." "Is that what this is?" she asked, a slight edge to her voice. "An explanation?" "It's whatever you want it to be," Benjamin said honestly. "An explanation, an apology, a second chance or just closure, if that's all you're willing to give." Something flickered in her eyes, pain, remembrance, or perhaps a shadow of the love they had once shared. "I think we need to talk before we decide what this is." Benjamin nodded, relief washing through him. She hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. It was more than he deserved. Perhaps somewhere more private? He suggested, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching their every move. Jessamine glanced around the church, then gave a slight nod. Turning to the assembled townspeople, she raised her voice slightly. Thank you all for coming. I know many of you traveled far to be here today, but Benjamin and I have matters to discuss before any vows can be exchanged. Please enjoy the refreshments at the hotel. We'll let you know what happens next. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Jessamine Miller stood up. You heard my daughter. The reception will go on as planned. The outcome of this wedding is yet to be determined. His authoritative tone silenced any objections. As the guests filed out, some offering sympathetic smiles to Jessamine, others casting curious glances at Benjamin, the church gradually emptied until only Pastor Williams remained with them. Would you like me to stay? The elderly pastor asked Jessamine gently. She shook her head. No, thank you, Pastor. I believe Benjamin and I need to speak alone. After the pastor departed, Benjamin and Jessamine stood in silence amid the floral arrangements and ribbons that had been placed with such hope. The organist had long since stopped playing, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the church clock and their own breathing. Perhaps we could walk, Benjamin suggested. The churchyard is peaceful this time of day. Jessamine nodded, and they moved side by side down the aisle and out into the sunlight. The June day was perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. They walked in silence to a small garden behind the church, where a wooden bench sat beneath an apple tree in full bloom. Jessamine smoothed her skirts as she sat, placing her bouquet beside her. Benjamin remained standing, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands. You look beautiful, he said finally, breaking the silence. Don't, she said quietly. Not yet, I need to understand first. Benjamin nodded, gathering his courage. I owe you the truth, all of it. He took a deep breath and began his story, starting with Marshal Daniel's arrival and continuing through the years that followed. He spoke of Billy's crimes, his own unwilling complicity, the years spent trying to rebuild his life and find a way back to her. I wrote to you once I was free of Billy's gang, he said. After he died. Did you ever receive my letters? Jessamine's expression tightened. 3 letters over 5 years, Benjamin, each one promising you'd return soon, yet years passed between them. The last one arrived 2 years ago, and then nothing. I wanted to be worthy of you before I came back, Benjamin explained. I needed to clear my name to build something to offer you. What I needed was the truth, Jessamine said, her voice breaking slightly. Do you have any idea what it was like, standing at that altar, waiting for hours, while the entire town watched with pity? Finding nothing but a hastily scribbled note saying you had to leave but would explain everything later. Her hands clenched in her lap. I thought you were dead for the first year. Then rumors started coming back, sightings of you with known outlaws. Some people said you'd had a secret wife elsewhere all along. Benjamin winced at her words. There was never anyone else, Jessamine, not for a single day. You should have trusted me with the truth, she said, meeting his gaze directly. If you'd told me about your brother, about the marshal, I would have understood. We could have postponed the wedding. I would have waited for you. I know that now, Benjamin admitted. I was young and foolish, torn between family loyalty and my love for you. I made the wrong choice in how I handled it, and I've paid for that mistake every day since. Jessamine was quiet for a long moment, studying the wildflowers in her bouquet. When you came back 3 months ago, I wasn't sure what to feel. Part of me wanted to run into your arms, and part of me wanted to slam the door in your face. I remember, Benjamin said with a sad smile. You did neither. You just looked at me like I was a stranger and said, "You're late." A ghost of a smile touched Jessamine's lips. It was all I could think to say. These past 3 months, Benjamin continued, getting to know you again, seeing the woman you've become, it's only made me love you more, Jessamine. You're stronger than the girl I left behind, more independent, more sure of yourself. I had to be, she said simply. When you left, I realized I couldn't build my life around waiting for a man. I took over the bookkeeping for my father's businesses. I helped expand the store. I built a life without you, Benjamin." "I know," he acknowledged, pain evident in his voice. "And if that life doesn't have room for me anymore, I'll understand. But when I proposed again 3 weeks ago, I meant every word. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Jessamine. I want to make up for the years we lost. And what about the next time your past comes calling?" She asked, the fear behind her question evident. "What happens if some other family obligation pulls you away?" Benjamin knelt before her, finally daring to take her hands in his. "Billy was the only family I had left, and he's gone now. But even if he weren't, I've learned my lesson. No obligation, no duty, nothing would make me leave you again without explanation, without your understanding. I'd cut off my right arm before I'd hurt you like that again." Tears gathered in Jessamine's eyes. "I want to believe you." "Then believe this," Benjamin said, his voice steady. "I'll be at that altar every Sunday for as long as it takes. If you don't come today, I'll be there next week and the week after. I'll wait for you this time, Jessamine, however long it takes." A tear slipped down Jessamine's cheek. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Even when I hated you for leaving, even when I tried to forget you, I couldn't stop loving you." Benjamin's heart soared at her words, but he tempered his hope. "Does that mean there's a chance for us?" Jessamine looked at their joined hands, then back at his face. "I came to the church today, didn't I?" "You did," Benjamin agreed, a cautious smile forming. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm willing to try," Jessamine said. "Not a wedding, not today, but perhaps a new beginning." Benjamin brought her hands to his lips, kissing them reverently. "A new beginning is all I ask for." Jessamine studied him for a long moment, then reached out to touch his face. "You have new scars." "Not all of them are visible," he admitted. She nodded in understanding. "We both have scars now, Benjamin, but perhaps they've made us stronger." As they sat together beneath the apple blossoms, the distance between them began to close, not completely, not yet, but enough to nurture hope. The path to rebuilding what they had lost would not be easy, but in that moment, with Jessamine's hand in his, Benjamin believed it was possible. They walked back to the church together, where Jackson Miller waited on the steps. His expression softened when he saw their joined hands. "Well," he asked his daughter. "We're going to take some time," Jessamine explained. "Start again, properly this time." Jackson nodded, then fixed Benjamin with a stern look. "You get one more chance, Wade, just one." "Yes, sir," Benjamin replied solemnly. "I understand." As word spread through Redemption Springs that the wedding had been postponed but not canceled, Benjamin felt a strange mix of disappointment and hope. He hadn't won back Jessamine's hand today, but he had something perhaps more precious: the opportunity to earn her trust again. That evening, as Benjamin walked Jessamine home from the impromptu gathering at the hotel, the setting sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. At her father's front porch, they paused. "May I call on you tomorrow?" Benjamin asked. Jessamine nodded. "I'd like that." She hesitated, then added, "There's something I need to show you, Benjamin, something important." "What is it?" he asked, curious at her suddenly serious tone. "Tomorrow," she said. "Come by after breakfast." With that enigmatic statement, she rose on tiptoes and brushed her lips against his cheek, the first such contact since his return, before disappearing inside. Benjamin stood on the porch for a long moment, his cheek tingling where her lips had touched. Whatever tomorrow would bring, he would face it with courage. He had a second chance with Jessamine, and this time, he wouldn't waste it. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of summer heat. Benjamin rose early, shaved with extra care, and dressed in clean work clothes rather than his wedding suit. Whatever Jessamine wanted to show him, he wanted to be ready for anything. As he walked through town toward the Miller house, he noticed a change in how people greeted him. The suspicion that had followed him since his return had softened somewhat, replaced by curious glances and even a few friendly nods. News traveled fast in Redemption Springs, and it seemed that Jessamine's willingness to give him another chance had influenced others to do the same. The Miller house stood on the edge of town, a handsome two-story structure with a wide front porch and carefully tended gardens. Benjamin knocked on the front door, his stomach knotted with anticipation. Jackson Miller answered, regarding Benjamin with a measured look before stepping aside. "She's in the kitchen. Asked me to send you through." "Thank you, sir," Benjamin replied, removing his hat as he entered. The house was much as he remembered it, though there were new curtains in the parlor and different pictures on the walls. He made his way to the kitchen, where delicious smells of baking bread filled the air. Jessamine stood at the large wooden table, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her apron. She looked up as he entered, a nervous smile playing at her lips. "Good morning," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning," Benjamin replied, suddenly feeling awkward despite their progress the day before. "Something smells wonderful." "Just bread for the week," she explained. "It needs to rise again before baking." She untied her apron and hung it on a hook. "Are you ready for what I need to show you?" Benjamin nodded, curious about her solemn tone. "Lead the way." To his surprise, Jessamine took a shawl from a peg by the back door. "We need to go to my cottage." "Your cottage?" Benjamin repeated, confused. Last he knew, Jessamine lived here with her father. "I had it built 3 years ago on the north corner of Pa's property," she explained. "I needed my own space." Benjamin followed her outside and down a well-worn path that led away from the main house, through an orchard of apple trees, and toward a stand of pines in the distance. As they walked, Jessamine maintained a slight distance between them, her expression thoughtful. "Are you going to give me any hints about what this is about?" Benjamin asked after several minutes of silence. Jessamine glanced at him, then looked ahead again. "It's something you need to see for yourself, something that might change everything." Her cryptic answer only heightened Benjamin's curiosity and apprehension. They continued walking until the trees thinned to reveal a charming one-story cottage with a small garden and a covered porch. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside. "It's lovely," Benjamin said, admiring the neat little home. "You built this yourself, with help from Pa and some of the ranch hands," Jessamine confirmed. "I designed it myself." She paused at the foot of the porch steps, turning to face him. "Benjamin, before we go in, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to show you, it wasn't meant to punish you or trick you. I didn't know how to tell you." Benjamin's unease grew. "Jessamine, whatever it is, we'll face it together." She searched his face, then nodded once and led him up the steps. She opened the door without knocking and motioned for him to enter first. The interior of the cottage was warm and inviting, with simple but tasteful furnishings. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the morning sunlight streamed through lace curtains. But what immediately caught Benjamin's attention was the woman sitting in a rocking chair near the fire, holding what appeared to be a child. As they entered, the woman, clearly a nanny or housekeeper, stood, cradling a small boy of perhaps 6 years of age. The child was thin and pale, with dark hair that curled around his ears. "Mrs. Cooper, thank you for watching him," Jessamine said softly. "We'll be fine now." The older woman nodded, carefully transferring the child to Jessamine's arms. "He's had his medicine and some broth. Fever's down from yesterday." With a curious glance at Benjamin, she gathered her shawl and departed, closing the door quietly behind her. Benjamin stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the child in Jessamine's arms. The boy's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. But even in sleep, there was no mistaking the shape of his face, the set of his jaw. "His name is Bryce Jackson Wade," Jessamine said quietly, meeting Benjamin's stunned gaze over the child's head. "He's your son." The world seemed to tilt beneath Benjamin's feet. He reached out to steady himself against the back of a nearby chair, his mind reeling with the implications of Jessamine's words. "My son," he repeated, the words foreign yet immediately true. Now that he looked more closely, he could see himself in the boy's features, the same nose, the same stubborn chin. "He was born 7 months after you left," Jessamine explained, her voice steady but tight with emotion. I didn't know I was with child when you disappeared. By the time I realized, you were already gone. Benjamin's legs felt weak. He sank into the nearest chair, his eyes never leaving the child's face. Why didn't you tell me in your letters? Your letters came years apart, Benjamin, Jessamine reminded him gently. The first one arrived when Bryce was nearly 2. You wrote of dangers, of being on the run. What was I supposed to do? Bring a toddler to find you in outlaw territory? The reality of her situation hit Benjamin like a physical blow. Not only had he abandoned Jessamine on their wedding day, but he had unknowingly left her to bear and raise his child alone. And when I returned 3 months ago, he asked, his voice hoarse. Jessamine carefully sat in the rocking chair, adjusting Bryce in her lap. The boy stirred but didn't wake, nestling against his mother's shoulder. I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you'd come back only for him and not for me, afraid you'd try to take him away, afraid you'd leave again and break his heart as you broke mine. She stroked the child's hair tenderly. I needed to be sure of your intentions before I introduced you. Benjamin nodded slowly, understanding washing over him. That's why you were so distant when I first returned, why you made me prove myself these past months. Yes, Jessamine acknowledged. I had to protect him. He's everything to me, Benjamin. Benjamin rose from his chair and moved cautiously toward them, kneeling beside the rocking chair to get a better look at his son's face. He's beautiful, he whispered, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. May I touch him? Jessamine nodded, and Benjamin reached out with a trembling hand to gently touch the boy's cheek. The contact sent a jolt through him, a connection so profound and immediate that tears sprang to his eyes. Is he ill? Benjamin asked, noting the child's pallor and the medicine misses. Cooper had mentioned. Jessamine's expression tightened. He was born early and has always been delicate. He has spells where his lungs trouble him, especially in winter or when the weather changes suddenly. Her voice dropped. There have been times I feared we might lose him. Benjamin felt a sharp pang of guilt and regret. I should have been here, for both of you. Yes, you should have, Jessamine agreed, but there was no accusation in her tone, only simple truth. Does he know about me? Benjamin asked. He knows his father loved horses and had to go away before he was born, Jessamine said. I never spoke ill of you to him, Benjamin. I couldn't bring myself to taint his image of his father, even when my own heart was broken. Benjamin's throat constricted with emotion. Thank you for that. For being stronger than I was. As if sensing he was the subject of their conversation, the boy's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were unmistakably Jessamine's, the same warm honey color. He blinked sleepily, first looking up at his mother, then turning his gaze to the stranger kneeling beside them. Mama, he asked in a small, slightly raspy voice. Good morning, my love, Jessamine said softly. Are you feeling better? The boy nodded, his curious gaze still fixed on Benjamin. Who is he? Jessamine met Benjamin's eyes over their son's head, a silent question in her expression. Benjamin nodded almost imperceptibly, ready to face whatever came next. Bryce, Jessamine said gently, this is Benjamin Wade, he's your father. The boy's eyes widened, and he studied Benjamin's face with an intensity that belied his young age. My pa. Yes, son, Benjamin said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your pa. Bryce continued to stare at him, processing this revelation. Mama said you were far away. I was, Benjamin acknowledged. Too far and for too long, but I've come back now. Are you staying? The boy asked directly, with a child's unerring ability to cut to the heart of the matter. Benjamin looked from his son to Jessamine, seeing both vulnerability and hope in her eyes. If you're Mama and you will have me, I'm never leaving again. I promise. Bryce seemed to consider this seriously, then extended a small hand toward Benjamin. I'm Bryce Jackson Wade, he introduced himself formally, clearly mimicking adult behavior he had observed. Benjamin gently took the tiny hand in his own, marveling at its perfect formation. I'm very pleased to meet you, Bryce Jackson Wade. The boy's face broke into a sudden smile, revealing a missing front tooth. "I can ride a horse," he announced proudly. "Grandpa lets me sit in front of him on Old Thunder." "Is that so?" Benjamin replied, smiling through his tears. "Well, I happen to know quite a bit about horses myself." "Mama says you're the best horse trainer in all the territories," Bryce said matter-of-factly. Benjamin glanced at Jessamine in surprise. She blushed slightly, but didn't deny it. "I've told him stories," she explained, "about how you could gentle the wildest Mustang with just your voice and patience." Something expanded in Benjamin's chest, the knowledge that despite everything, Jessamine had kept him alive in their son's imagination as someone worthy of admiration. Bryce began to cough then, a worrying, rattling sound that shook his small frame. Jessamine immediately reached for a cup of water on the side table, helping him drink small sips until the spell passed. "I think that's enough excitement for now," she said, her concern evident. "You need to rest a bit more, sweetheart." "But Pa just got here," Bryce protested weakly, the episode having clearly drained his limited energy. The word "Pa" from his son's lips nearly undid Benjamin completely. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "I'll be right here when you wake up." This seemed to satisfy the boy, who leaned back against his mother's shoulder, his eyelids already growing heavy again. Jessamine rose carefully. "I'm going to put him down for a while. His bedroom is just through there." She nodded toward a doorway off the main room. Benjamin waited in the sitting room, his mind and heart racing as he tried to absorb the monumental change in his life. He had come to Redemption Springs hoping to reclaim the woman he loved, only to discover he was also a father. The responsibility was overwhelming, but beneath the shock and guilt lay a fierce, protective love that had ignited the moment he laid eyes on his son. When Jessamine returned a few minutes later, she found Benjamin standing by the window, staring out at the Montana landscape. "He's sleeping," she said softly. "He tires easily, especially after his lungs trouble him." Benjamin turned to face her. "Has he seen doctors? Is there treatment?" Jessamine nodded. "The best I could find. We even traveled to Denver last year to consult a specialist. They say he may grow stronger as he gets older, but..." She left the sentence unfinished, the worry she lived with daily evident in her expression. In 3 strides, Benjamin crossed the room and gathered her in his arms. This time, she didn't resist, melting against him as if the strength that had sustained her for 7 years suddenly gave way. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into her hair. "So sorry I wasn't here, that you had to face all this alone." "I wasn't entirely alone," Jessamine said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Pa has been wonderful. The whole town rallied around us. But there were nights when Bryce was ill, when I didn't know if he'd see morning, that I prayed for you to come home." Benjamin held her tighter, feeling her tears dampen his shirt. "I'm here now," he vowed. "And I'm staying, Jessamine, not just for Bryce, but for you, if you'll have me." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes shining with tears, but also with something that looked remarkably like hope. "I brought you here today because you needed to know the truth before we could move forward. Bryce and I are a package deal, Benjamin." "The best package I could ever imagine," Benjamin said sincerely. "Finding out about him doesn't change my feelings for you, Jessamine. It only makes me love you more, for your strength, your grace in raising our son." Jessamine searched his face, perhaps looking for any sign of insincerity or reservation. Finding none, she asked, "What happens now?" Benjamin took a deep breath. "That depends on you. My feelings are clear. I want to be a husband to you and a father to Bryce. I want us to be a family. But I understand if you need more time." She was quiet for a moment, her hand absently tracing patterns on his chest. "When you proposed 3 weeks ago, I almost told you about Bryce then, but something held me back. I needed to be sure you were staying for me, not out of obligation to a child you didn't yet know." "And now?" Benjamin asked, his heart in his throat. "Now I believe you," she said simply. "I see it in your eyes when you look at me, and I saw it when you met our son." She took a steadying breath. "I'm still afraid, Benjamin. afraid of trusting again, afraid of what might happen if Bryce grows too attached, and I won't leave, Benjamin interrupted firmly. Not ever again. Whatever comes, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together. Jessamine nodded slowly, then reached up to touch his face. Then yes, Benjamin Wade, yes to your proposal, yes to being your wife. But not a big church wedding this time, something simple with just family and close friends, and soon before. She didn't finish the thought, but Benjamin understood her concern. If Bryce's health was as precarious as it seemed, she wanted to ensure their son saw his parents married. As soon as you like, Benjamin agreed, his heart soaring despite the circumstances. Tomorrow, if Pastor Williams is available. A genuine smile curved Jessamine's lips. Perhaps not quite that soon, but within the week, I think. Benjamin sealed their agreement with a kiss, their first real kiss since his return, tender and sweet with promise. When they parted, Jessamine rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Will you stay for a while? She asked. Bryce will want to see you when he wakes. Wild horses couldn't drag me away, Benjamin promised. They spent the rest of the day in the cottage, talking in low voices while Bryce slept. Benjamin learned about his son's first steps, his first words, his love of stories about horses and cowboys. Jessamine told him about the difficult birth, the countless nights spent watching over their sickly child, the joy of seeing his smile each morning. When Bryce awoke in the late afternoon, he seemed stronger, his eyes brighter. He sat up in bed, excited to find his father still there as promised. Can you tell me a horse story? He asked Benjamin eagerly. Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed and began a tale about a wild Mustang he had once gentled, embellishing certain parts to make the boy laugh. Watching his son's face light up with wonder, Benjamin felt a completeness he had never known before. That evening, after Bryce had been fed and tucked in for the night, Benjamin walked with Jessamine back to the main house, where Jessamine Miller waited on the porch. I take it he knows now, the older man said, eyeing their joined hands. Yes, Pa, Jessamine confirmed, and we've decided to marry, soon. Jackson nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. About time, that boy needs his father. He fixed Benjamin with a stern look. And you, Wade, you'd best be the father he deserves. I intend to be, sir, Benjamin replied with conviction. I've missed too much already. I won't miss a day more than I have to. Jackson extended his hand, which Benjamin grasped firmly. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was acceptance, and for now, that was enough. As Benjamin made his way back to his rented room above the livery stable that night, his mind whirled with plans. He would need to build a proper home for his family, large enough for Jessamine and Bryce, with room for more children if they were blessed with them. He would need to establish his horse training business more firmly, create a stable income to support them, and pay for whatever medical care Bryce might need. But most importantly, he needed to be the husband and father they deserved, present, loving, and steadfast. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but for the first time in his life, Benjamin felt equal to the task. With Jessamine and Bryce by his side, he could face anything. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity as preparations for a small wedding took shape. Pastor Williams agreed to perform the ceremony on Saturday, giving them just 5 days to prepare. Word spread quickly through Redemption Springs, and while some townspeople raised eyebrows at the hasty timeline, most were supportive, especially those who had watched Jessamine's struggle as a single mother. Benjamin divided his time between his work with the horses at the Miller Ranch, helping Jessamine prepare and getting to know his son. Each moment with Bryce was precious, and Benjamin soaked up every detail about the boy, his fascination with butterflies, his thoughtful questions about the world, his stubborn determination to keep up with stronger children despite his frail health. On the 3rd day after their reunion, Benjamin took Bryce for a gentle ride on a docile mare named Daisy, holding his son securely before him in the saddle. The joy on the boy's face as they walked the horse around the paddock was something Benjamin knew he would never forget. "Can we go faster, Pa?" Bryce asked, bouncing slightly in the saddle. "Not today, partner," Benjamin replied, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "We need to build up your riding muscles first, but soon, I promise." Bryce accepted this with surprising grace. "Mama says I have to be patient with my body, that it's not as strong as my spirit." Benjamin's heart clenched at the wisdom in his young son's words. "Your mama's right, as usual, but you know what? With practice and care, your body will get stronger. And until then, I'll be right here to help you do whatever you set your mind to." The boy twisted in the saddle to look up at him. "Promise you won't go away again?" "I promise," Benjamin said solemnly. "Nothing in this world could make me leave you and your mama again." Bryce studied his face with that unnervingly direct gaze, then nodded once, apparently satisfied. "Good. Because I prayed for a pa every night, and now you're here." Benjamin had to swallow hard before he could speak. "Well then, I'm mighty glad you're so good at praying." As they continued their slow circuit of the paddock, Benjamin caught sight of Jessamine watching from the fence, her expression a mixture of joy and lingering fear. He guided Daisy toward her, and when they reached the fence, Bryce excitedly recounted every moment of his riding experience. "I see you're both enjoying yourselves," Jessamine said, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. "Pa says I need riding muscles," Bryce informed her seriously, "but I can get them with practice." "I'm sure you can," she agreed, reaching over the fence to brush a smudge of dirt from his cheek. To Benjamin, she added, "Not too much longer. He tires easily." "We're almost done," Benjamin assured her. "Just one more circuit, right, Bryce?" The boy nodded eagerly, and they completed their ride with Jessamine walking alongside the fence. When Benjamin lifted Bryce down from the saddle, the boy's legs wobbled slightly, but his face shone with accomplishment. "I rode a horse, Mama," he exclaimed. "A real ride, not just sitting in front of Grandpa." "You certainly did," Jessamine praised, taking his hand. "And now I think someone needs a rest before supper." Bryce started to protest, but was interrupted by a yawn he couldn't suppress. "Will you come to the cottage for supper, Pa?" he asked Benjamin. "If your mama invites me, I'd be honored," Benjamin replied, looking to Jessamine. She smiled, the tension that had been her constant companion beginning to ease. "Of course. Come by at 6. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in Jessamine's cottage, Benjamin marveled at how quickly they were becoming a family. Bryce chattered happily between bites, asking Benjamin dozens of questions about horses, about the places he'd been, about what they would do together now that he was home. After Bryce was tucked into bed, Benjamin and Jessamine sat before the fire, planning their future together. The wedding would be small but meaningful, with Bryce serving as ring-bearer if he was well enough. They would live in Jessamine's cottage until Benjamin could complete a larger home on a plot of land Jackson had offered them, part of Jessamine's eventual inheritance from the Miller ranch. "I've been thinking," Benjamin said, taking Jessamine's hand in his. "After we're married, perhaps we should consider taking Bryce to see specialists in the East. I've heard there are doctors in Boston and New York who have had success with childhood lung ailments." Jessamine's eyes widened. "The cost would be enormous, Benjamin. The trip alone, not to mention the doctor's fees." "I've saved almost everything I earned these past 5 years," Benjamin revealed. "It's not a fortune, but it's enough to get us there and pay for the best care we can find. And if it's not, I'll work day and night until we have what we need." Tears filled Jessamine's eyes. "You do that? Spend everything you've saved?" "For our son, without hesitation," Benjamin said firmly. "Nothing matters more than his health and happiness." Jessamine leaned forward and kissed him, a gesture full of gratitude and love. "Just when I think I couldn't love you more, Benjamin Wade, you prove me wrong." On Saturday morning, Benjamin stood once again at the altar of Redemption Springs Small Church. This time, however, the circumstances were vastly different. Only about 20 people filled the pews, close friends and family, who had supported Jessamine through the years of Benjamin's absence. The decorations were simple but elegant, with wildflowers similar to those Jessamine had carried on that day when she had come to hear his explanation. Most importantly, standing beside Benjamin was his son, dressed in a new suit and looking stronger than he had just days before. Bryce took his role as ring-bearer very seriously, practicing his slow walk down the aisle until he was confident he could manage without tiring. When the church doors opened and Jessamine appeared on her father's arm, Benjamin felt the same catch in his breath he had experienced the first time he'd seen her. She wore a simple blue dress rather than a traditional wedding gown, her chestnut hair arranged with wildflowers instead of a veil. To Benjamin, she had never looked more beautiful. As she walked toward him, her eyes locked with his, Benjamin silently renewed the vow he had made to himself to be worthy of this second chance, to be the husband and father his family deserved. Jackson placed Jessamine's hand in Benjamin's, giving his future son-in-law a nod that conveyed both blessing and warning. Then he took his seat in the front pew, lifting Bryce onto his lap so the boy could see better. Pastor Williams smiled at the couple before him. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Benjamin Wade and Jessamine Miller in holy matrimony. Their path to this altar has not been straight or easy, but perhaps that makes their arrival here all the more meaningful." As the pastor continued, Benjamin squeezed Jessamine's hand gently, overwhelmed by gratitude for her forgiveness and her love. When it came time for the rings, Bryce proudly stepped forward, presenting the simple gold bands on a small cushion. "I, Benjamin Wade, take you, Jessamine Miller, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Benjamin said, his voice steady and clear. "I promise to love, honor, and cherish you, in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, from this day forward until death parts us." He slipped the ring onto her finger, adding quietly, "This time, I won't let you down." Jessamine blinked back tears as she repeated her vows, placing the matching band on Benjamin's finger. "With this ring, I thee wed, and pledge you my faith and my heart from this day forward." "By the power vested in me," Pastor Williams proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Benjamin, you may kiss your bride." As their lips met in a tender kiss, sealing their vows and their future, the small congregation erupted in applause. When they turned to face their friends and family, Benjamin lifted Bryce into his arms, including their son in the moment of celebration. "We're officially a family now," Benjamin told the boy. "Forever?" Bryce asked. "Forever," Jessamine confirmed, her hand finding Benjamin's free one. The small reception that followed at the Miller house was joyous and relaxed. Neighbors brought dishes to share, music played on the piano in the parlor, and stories were told, some about Benjamin and Jessamine's courtship years ago, others about Bryce's antics as a toddler. As the celebration continued, Benjamin found a moment to speak privately with Jackson Miller on the front porch. "I want to thank you," Benjamin said to the older man, "for taking care of them when I couldn't, for being the father and grandfather they needed." Jackson studied him for a moment before responding. "It wasn't a burden, they're my blood." He paused, then added, "But they needed you too, especially that boy in there." "I know," Benjamin acknowledged, "and I swear to you I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the time I lost." Jackson nodded slowly. "See that you do." Then, with a slight softening of his stern expression, he added, "Welcome to the family, son, officially this time." Later that evening, after Bryce had fallen asleep in a makeshift bed in what would now be their shared cottage, Benjamin and Jessamine stood on the porch, gazing at the stars that blanketed the Montana sky. "Mrs. Wade," Benjamin said softly, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind. "Do you know how long I've waited to call you that?" Jessamine leaned back against his chest, her hands covering his where they rested at her waist. "About as long as I've waited to hear it, I imagine." 7 years, 1 month, and 15 days, Benjamin said precisely. "Not that I was counting." She laughed softly, turning in his arms to face him. "Was it worth the wait?" "Every second, he assured her, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future full of possibility. 5 years later, Benjamin Wade stood on the porch of the home he had built for his family, watching as his son guided a young colt around the corral. At 11 years old, Bryce was still smaller than other boys his age, but the frailty that had marked his early childhood had gradually given way to a wiry strength. The journey to health had not been easy. The family had indeed traveled east to consult specialists, spending nearly a year in Boston while Bryce underwent treatments that had helped strengthen his lungs. "He has your way with horses," Jessamine said, joining Benjamin on the porch, their 3-year-old daughter Joanna perched on her hip. "And your determination," Benjamin replied, smiling as Bryce patiently corrected the colt when it tried to nip at his sleeve. Their second child, Joanna, had been born robust and healthy, with her mother's honey-colored eyes and her father's dark hair. Now, squirming to be put down, she pointed excitedly toward her brother. "Want to see Bryce?" she demanded, still struggling with her R's. "After supper, little one," Jessamine promised. "Bryce needs to finish his training session without distractions." Benjamin took his daughter from Jessamine's arms, swinging her high to make her giggle. "Your brother is becoming quite the horse trainer, Joanna. Maybe he'll teach you when you're a bit older." "Now," the toddler insisted, making both parents laugh. "Patience isn't her strong suit," Jessamine observed wryly. "Can't imagine where she gets that from," Benjamin teased, earning a playful swat from his wife. As they watched Bryce complete his work with the colt, returning the young animal to its stall with gentle praise, Benjamin reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The path had not been without challenges. Bryce's health had suffered setbacks. The horse breeding business had weathered difficult seasons, and the ghosts of Benjamin's past had occasionally returned in the form of nightmares that left him shaking in the dark. But through it all, Jessamine had been his constant, her love and forgiveness a daily reminder of the second chance he had been granted. Together, they had built not just a home but a life filled with purpose and joy. Bryce jogged toward the house, his cheeks flushed with exertion, but his breathing steady, a vast improvement from the sickly child who had once struggled to walk across a room. "Did you see, Pa?" he called. "Thunder's legacy is taking to the bit much better today." "I saw," Benjamin confirmed proudly. "You've got a natural touch, son." Jessamine smiled at her firstborn. "Wash up for supper, please, and tell your grandfather it's ready. He's in his workshop." Jackson Miller had moved into a small but comfortable cabin on their property 2 years earlier, after deciding the main Miller house was too large for one man. He spent his days crafting furniture and toys for his grandchildren, and helping with the horse breeding operation that had become the family's main source of income. As they gathered around the supper table that evening, Benjamin, Jessamine, Bryce, little Joanna, and Jackson Benjamin found himself overwhelmed with gratitude. Looking at his wife across the table, he caught her eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you," silently. She understood without explanation, as she always did. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for forgiving. Thank you for believing in second chances." Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Benjamin and Jessamine sat on the porch swing, watching as a summer storm rolled in across the distant mountains. "I had a letter from Tom Mercer today," Jessamine mentioned, referring to the sheriff who had stood with Benjamin at the altar that first time. "He's retiring next month." "Is that right?" Benjamin replied, his arm around her shoulders. Hard to imagine Redemption Springs without Sheriff Mercer keeping the peace. "He suggested you might consider running for the position," Jessamine said, watching her husband's reaction carefully. "Said the town could use a man with your sense of justice and experience." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sheriff Wade," he said finally, testing the sound of it. "What do you think?" "I think you'd be excellent," Jessamine said honestly. "You understand people, Benjamin. You know how it feels to make mistakes and find redemption." "That's valuable in a lawman." Benjamin kissed the top of her head, inhaling the lavender scent of her hair. "I'll think about it. It would mean being in town more, but we're close enough that I could still be home every night." "That's all I ask," Jessamine said, nestling closer against his side as the first raindrops began to fall. "That you come home to us. Always." "Always," Benjamin promised, knowing it was one vow he would never break. As the rain intensified, they moved inside, closing the door on the storm but leaving the windows open to catch the fresh, clean scent of summer rain. In their bedroom, with moonlight filtering through lace curtains, Benjamin held his wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "what would have happened if I hadn't left that first time, if I'd married you as planned?" Jessamine considered the question thoughtfully. "Sometimes, but then I think perhaps we wouldn't appreciate what we have quite so much. Sometimes you have to lose something to truly understand its value." "I understood your value," Benjamin disagreed gently. "I just didn't understand myself. I thought I had to choose between loyalty to my brother and love for you. I didn't realize I could have honored both by being honest with you." "We were young," Jessamine reminded him. "Both of us. And look at us now, 2 children, a thriving business, a home filled with love. Perhaps this is exactly the path we were meant to travel." Benjamin pulled her closer, grateful beyond words for her wisdom and her capacity for forgiveness. "I love you, Jessamine Wade, more today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, sealing her words with a kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows. Outside, the storm washed the world clean, while inside, Benjamin Wade held his future in his arms, the woman who had waited, the woman who had forgiven, the woman who had said yes when he stood once more at the altar he had left empty. Second chances, Benjamin reflected as he drifted toward sleep with Jessamine in his arms, were rare and precious gifts. And this life they had built together was the greatest blessing a man could ask for. In the years that followed, Benjamin Wade did indeed become sheriff of Redemption Springs, serving the community with the same dedication he brought to his family. Bryce grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over the family's horse breeding business and expanding it throughout the territory. Little Joanna blossomed into a spirited young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's charm, eventually becoming the town's schoolteacher. And through it all, Benjamin and Jessamine remained each other's anchors, their love deepening with each passing year. The altar Benjamin had once left empty had become the foundation of a life filled with purpose, joy, and the enduring power of forgiveness. When visitors to Redemption Springs commented on the obvious devotion between the sheriff and his wife, even after decades of marriage, locals would sometimes share the story of the cowboy who stood at the altar twice, and the woman whose love was strong enough to give him a second chance.